Have you ever stood in your garden in June staring at rows of tomatoes and lettuce that are already wilting, wondering why you're doing this whole cycle again? Buy seeds, dig, plant, water every single day, pray it doesn't frost, doesn't flood, doesn't get eaten by something. And then in October, you rip it all out and start from zero. Again, here's the truth nobody tells beginner gardeners. You're not failing because you lack a green thumb. You're failing because you're playing a rigged game. Annual vegetables are built to live fast and die young. That's literally their biology. They rush to produce seed and then they're done, and you're left buying more seeds next spring, forever, on a loop that never ends. But there's a completely different way to garden, one that almost nobody talks about. Instead of planting crops that die every year, you plant crops that live for decades. You put in the work once, maybe over a single season, and then the plant just keeps producing. Year after year, decade after decade. Some of these plants will outlive the person who planted them. Today, I'm going to walk you through 10 crops like that. Plant them once, and they will feed you, and possibly your children, for the rest of your life. Pay very close attention to number 4, because it's not just food, it's basically a free grocery store growing on a stick that requires almost nothing from you. Before we start, drop in the comments what zone you're gardening in, and what part of the world you're watching from. I want to see how far this list can travel. Let's get into it. Crop number 10, horseradish, the root that refuses to die. Most people only think of horseradish as a condiment, something you grate onto a steak once a year. That's a massive underestimation of what this plant actually is. Horseradish is one of the toughest perennial root crops you can put in the ground, and once it's established, it is almost impossible to get rid of, which for a survival garden is exactly the point. Horseradish thrives in USDA zones 3 through 9, which means it can handle brutal winters in places like North Dakota just as easily as it handles the humid summers of Georgia. The roots go dormant underground when it's cold and come roaring back the moment the soil warms up. You don't baby this plant. You don't fertilize it constantly. You plant a root cutting, walk away, and let it do its thing. Here's what most people don't realize. The roots aren't just a spicy condiment, they're a genuine long-term food and medicine source. Horseradish root is rich in vitamin C and has natural antimicrobial properties, which made it a staple in old root cellars long before refrigeration existed. You can dig up as much as you need in the fall, and the rest just sits in the ground as a living pantry, waiting for you. One warning that's actually a benefit. Horseradish spreads aggressively. Every little root fragment left in the soil can grow into a brand new plant. In a normal garden, that's called being invasive. In a survival food system, that's called free expansion. Plant it once in a dedicated bed or container to keep it contained, and you'll have a permanent root harvest for the rest of your life. Crop number 9, hazelnut bushes. The 50-year nut factory. If you want real calories, real fat, and real protein from a plant that requires almost no maintenance, hazelnut bushes are one of the smartest investments you can make in your yard. These aren't delicate fruit trees that need spraying and pruning schedules. They're tough, multi-stemmed shrubs that can produce nuts for over 50 years once they mature. Hazelnuts grow well across USDA zones 4 through 9, adapting to everything from the cold Northeast to the milder Pacific Northwest, which is actually one of the best regions in the country for growing them. They like well-drained soil and a decent amount of sun, but beyond that, they're remarkably forgiving. It typically takes 3 to 5 years before a hazelnut bush starts producing a meaningful harvest. But once it does, a single mature bush can produce several pounds of nuts every single autumn. Nuts are one of the most calorie-dense, shelf-stable foods you can grow. Unlike leafy greens or soft fruit, hazelnuts store for months without refrigeration, which makes them one of the most valuable long-term survival foods on this entire list. Plant 2 or 3 bushes near each other because hazelnuts produce better yields with cross-pollination. Do that once, and you've built yourself a nut orchard that will still be feeding your family long after most annual crops would have been replanted 50 separate times. Crop number 8, mulberry trees. The fruit machine nobody plants on purpose. Mulberry trees have a strange reputation. Most people think of them as messy weed trees that stain sidewalks purple. What they're missing is that a single mature mulberry tree can produce hundreds of pounds of fruit in a single season, with essentially zero effort from you. Mulberries grow across an enormous range, from USDA Zone 4 all the way to Zone 9, and they tolerate drought, poor soil, pollution, and neglect better than almost any fruit tree in existence. This is not an exaggeration. Mulberries are one of the few fruit trees that genuinely thrive on being ignored. Unlike apples or peaches, Mulberry trees rarely need spraying for pests or disease. They fruit reliably every single year without complicated pruning schedules. The berries themselves are sweet, nutrient-dense, and can be eaten fresh, dried for long-term storage, or turned into syrup. And because mulberries ripen over several weeks rather than all at once, you get a rolling harvest instead of a single overwhelming glut. There's a bonus most people never think about. The leaves are edible too, and in many parts of the world they're cooked like greens. So you're not just getting fruit, you're getting a backup source of greens from the exact same tree. Plant one mulberry tree, and within just a few years, you'll wonder why anyone bothers with fussier fruit trees at all. Crop number 7. Black currant bushes. The vitamin vault. Black currants are one of the most nutrient-dense fruits you can grow, and almost nobody in North America plants them, mostly because of an old, outdated legal restriction that's since been lifted in most states. That's a shame, because black currants are basically a walking multivitamin on a bush. These plants thrive in USDA zones 3 through 8, which means they handle cold winters extremely well, actually requiring a certain amount of winter chill to fruit properly the following summer. They prefer moist, well-drained soil and partial shade, making them one of the few fruiting shrubs that actually does well in those tricky shaded corners of your yard where nothing else wants to grow. Once established, a single black currant bush can produce for 15 to 20 years, giving you several pounds of berries annually with very little ongoing work beyond occasional pruning. The berries themselves contain roughly 4 times the vitamin C of an orange, which made them a critical food source in wartime Britain when citrus imports were cut off. Black currants are tart, so most people cook them into jams, syrups, or juices, all of which preserve extremely well for long-term storage. In a system built around resilience, having a fruit that's both incredibly nutritious and easy to store for winter is exactly the kind of insurance policy you want growing in your backyard. Quick pause here. If you're starting to see the pattern, that real food security doesn't come from a bunker full of cans, it comes from living systems that regenerate themselves, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. Crop number 6. Welsh onion. The one that never asks you to replant. If you're tired of buying onion sets every spring, only half of them bolt or rot. The Welsh onion, sometimes called a bunching onion, solves that problem permanently. Unlike a regular onion that forms one bulb and dies after harvest, Welsh onions grow in clumps that just keep multiplying on their own. This plant is astonishingly cold hardy, thriving in USDA zones 3 through 9. In colder regions, the tops die back in winter and simply regrow from the same root clump every spring, no replanting required. In milder climates, it can stay green and harvestable almost year-round. Here's the real advantage. Instead of harvesting a whole plant and losing it, you snip what you need from the outer edges of the clump, and the plant keeps growing from the center. It's a renewable harvest, not a one-time harvest. Over a few years, a single planting can spread into a thick, permanent onion patch that requires basically no attention beyond an occasional division. Onions are one of those ingredients that make every other meal better, and having a self-sustaining supply of them growing quietly in the corner of your garden is one of the most underrated moves you can make toward long-term food independence. Crop number 5. Fig trees. The drought-proof fruit fortress. Fig trees have been feeding civilizations for thousands of years for a very simple reason. They are almost impossible to kill. Once established, a fig tree can survive extended drought, poor rocky soil, and years of neglect while still producing fruit, sometimes 2 harvests in a single season. While figs are traditionally associated with warm Mediterranean climates, hardy varieties now allow them to be grown successfully in USDA zones 6 through 9, and with winter protection, even colder zones can grow them as a dieback shrub that resprouts from the roots each spring. That means fig trees are far more accessible across the country than most people assume. Figs are calorie-dense, naturally sweet, and dry beautifully for long-term storage without any need for added sugar. A dried fig can sit in a pantry for well over a year, making this one of the most practical fruits for building a genuine food reserve. Perhaps the most valuable trait of a fig tree is its resilience. Even if the top of the tree is damaged by an unusually harsh winter, the root system often survives and sends up new growth. You are, in a very real sense, planting something that is extremely difficult to permanently lose. Crop number 4. Chestnut trees. The bread tree. This is the one I told you to pay attention to. Chestnut trees were once called the bread tree throughout parts of Europe and Asia, and for good reason. Chestnuts are unlike other nuts. They're low in fat and high in complex carbohydrates, meaning they can actually replace grain in a diet, not just supplement it. Chestnut trees grow well in USDA zones 4 through 8 and prefer well-drained, slightly acidic soil. They take longer to mature than smaller shrubs, typically 5 to 7 years before significant nut production begins, but a single mature chestnut tree can produce well over 100 pounds of nuts in a good year. And chestnut trees can live and produce for well over a century. Here's what makes chestnuts genuinely special in a resilient food system. They can be dried and ground into flour, giving you a true grain substitute that doesn't require annual tilling, planting, or the fragile boom-and-bust cycle of wheat or corn. In a world where grain supply chains can be disrupted overnight, having a tree that quietly manufactures flour ingredients every autumn is an enormous advantage. Chestnut trees also improve the soil around them and provide shade and habitat, meaning they support the rest of your food system just by existing. Plant one now, and by the time it reaches full maturity, it could be feeding grandchildren who haven't been born yet. Crop number 3, elderberry, the medicine cabinet that also feeds you. Elderberry bushes occupy a unique spot on this list because they blur the line between food and medicine. The berries, once cooked, are packed with antioxidants and have long been used to support the immune system, while also being genuinely useful in syrups, jams, and wine. Elderberries are remarkably adaptable, growing well across USDA zones 3 through 8. They tolerate wet soil better than almost any other fruiting shrub on this list, which makes them perfect for those low, soggy corners of a property where other plants struggle or rot. Once established, elderberry bushes grow fast, often reaching full size within just 2 to 3 years, and then produce reliably for decades with very little maintenance beyond occasional pruning. A mature bush can produce clusters of berries so heavy the branches bend under the weight. Important note: the raw berries and other parts of the plant contain compounds that need to be cooked before eating, so this isn't a snack-off-the-branch plant like a mulberry. But once you understand how to process it, elderberry becomes one of the most valuable dual-purpose plants you can own, feeding your family while also stocking your home apothecary. Crop number 2, dwarf heirloom apple trees, the legacy fruit. Apple trees get overlooked in survival gardening circles because people assume they're difficult, but modern dwarf and semi-dwarf heirloom varieties have completely changed that equation. These trees stay small enough to manage easily, often maxing out at 8 to 12 feet, while still producing full-sized harvests of fruit. Apples grow across an enormous range, from USDA zones 3 through 9 depending on the variety, meaning there's very likely a variety suited exactly to your climate. Heirloom varieties in particular tend to be far more disease-resistant than modern grocery store types, because they were bred over generations for resilience, not shelf appearance. A mature apple tree can produce well over 100 pounds of fruit in a good year, and unlike soft fruits, apples store for months in cool, dark conditions without any processing at all. They can also be dried, turned into cider, or made into vinegar, giving you multiple long-term storage options from a single harvest. The real value of an apple tree, though, is generational. A well-cared-for apple tree can live and produce for 80 to 100 years. Planting one heirloom apple tree today isn't just feeding you this decade. It's building a piece of food infrastructure that could still be standing and fruiting when your grandchildren are adults. Crop number 1, walnut trees. The multi-generational vault. If you only plant one thing from this entire list, let it be a walnut tree. This isn't just food, it's one of the single greatest long-term investments you can make in your property's ability to feed people, because a healthy walnut tree can live and produce nuts for well over 100 years. Walnuts grow across USDA zones 4 through 9, tolerating everything from harsh northern winters to hot summers, as long as they have deep, well-drained soil to sink their extensive root systems into. They take longer than almost anything else on this list to reach full production, often 8 to 10 years, which is exactly why almost nobody plants them anymore. We've become a culture obsessed with instant results. But here's the payoff for patience. A single mature walnut tree can produce well over 100 pounds of nuts annually, and walnuts are one of the most calorie and nutrient-dense foods that exists in nature. They're rich in healthy fats, protein, and store for a full year or more without spoiling when kept dry and cool. This is not a garnish crop. This is a legitimate staple food source growing quietly in your backyard. Walnut trees also provide dense shade and valuable timber, meaning even the tree itself, decades from now, represents real material value beyond the food it produces. Planting a walnut tree is an act of extreme long-term thinking. You likely won't get the biggest harvests in your own lifetime.
Pray it doesn't frost,
but you will be handing your children or grandchildren a food source, and then in October, you rip it all out and start from zero. Build again. So there you have
Here's
it.
the truth.
Nobody
Crops
tells
that
beginner
once you plant
gardeners,
them,
quietly
you're not
work for
failing
you
because
for
you lack
decades,
a green
sometimes
thumb.
for a full
You're
century.
failing because
without
you're demanding
demanding
the
the
exhausting
exhausting
yearly
yearly
vegetables
cycle
are
buying
built to
seeds,
live fast
tilling
and
soil,
die
and hoping for the
That's
best.
literally their biology.
This is what real food
They rush to
security
produce seed
actually
and then
looks
they're
like.
done, and you're
It's
left
not buying more
stockpiling
seeds
cans
next
in a
spring
basement
forever.
It's building
on a
a
living
loop that never
systems that
ends.
regenerate
But there's a
themselves
completely
whether you're
different
paying
way to
attention
garden,
or not.
one that almost
you don't
nobody
need to
talks
plant
about.
all 10 this year.
Instead of planting
Pick 2 or
crops
3
that die
that fit
every
your
year,
climate and
you
your
plant
space,
crops that
and
live
get
for
them
decades.
in the ground this
you
season.
put in the work once.
The biggest
maybe
mistake
over a
people make with
season.
perennial food
and then the
systems
plant just
is
keeps
waiting for the
producing
perfect moment
year
that never
after year,
comes.
decade
The
after
best time
decade.
to plant a walnut
Some of these
tree was
plants
20
will
years
outlive
ago.
the person who
The
planted
second
them.
best time
Today,
is today.
I'm going to walk
If
you
this
through
gave
10
you a
crops like
completely
that.
new way
Plant
of
them
thinking
once,
about
and
your
they will
garden,
feed you.
smash
and
that like
possibly your
button
children
so it reaches
for the
more
rest of your
people
life.
who are still
Pay
stuck
very
buying
close
seed
attention
packets
to number
every spring.
4, because
And
it's
not
subscribe,
just food,
because
it's
there's a lot
basically
more
a free
where this
grocery
came from.
store growing on
Your
a stick
yard
that
has the
requires
potential to be
almost
more
nothing
than
from you.
decoration.
Before
It
we
can be
start,
your family's
drop
food
in the comments
security
what
for the
zone
rest
you're
of your
gardening
life,
in and
go
what
start
part of the
building it.
world